Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today, I have back on our show Dr. Warwick Powell from Australia. Um, first of all, welcome back, Warwick, and it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. You always have very interesting insight to offer. What do you have for us today?
Well, last time we caught up, I said that I felt like I'd aged a year in the space of a month, right? This last fortnight has probably been, in some ways, a little bit quieter, but there've been some very interesting things which probably speak a little bit to, look, I think actually the fragile state of Western self-esteem. So we've had in Hong Kong the sentencing of Jimmy Lai. And that has provoked this tidal wave in the last, last day or so since his sentencing of Western social media from all of the usual suspects, mainly Western politicians and assorted think tanks and NGOs, talking about how this is a freedom fighter. An advocate for democracy being jailed for exercising freedom of speech, to a point where I think some have even said that a British subject, a British citizen, is being jailed for life and is being sentenced to death. Right? And of course, amongst the tidal wave of propaganda responses, the actual issues have probably become a little bit lost, the whole point of propaganda. But it's probably worth revisiting the issues a little bit, because I think it actually says something about the state of Western self-esteem. So Jimmy Lai was, and we know this because there's plenty of public evidence and, 1,000 days in court, or 600 days or whatever it was, right? Mountains of evidence that actually shows that he was extremely close to people who were paid by the three-letter agencies, and was an actual advocate for American military intervention. So
his second in command, Mark Simon, literally come from a CIA family. I mean, this is well established. Yeah.
So I don't think that there's actually any secret that Jimmy Lai was part of an American destabilization / regime change frontline operation. And he was charged ultimately with sedition and for collusion with foreign powers. Now, I don't know whether it was collusion or not, because collusion kind of implies that it was done in secret. But when you're actually on a global stage calling for America to launch nuclear weapons on China, I'm not sure that that's collusion, right? It's certainly not the secret type of collusion. But he was charged under national security laws. Now, those national security laws were, of course, the subject of much controversy, and the Western press will talk about them as being pernicious and this and that. But of course, they're by and large mirrored on national security laws that you find in just about every other country in the world. And the other point to remember is that the national security laws passed by Hong Kong was actually part and parcel of the original agreement, right, with the British, that there would be national security laws. And so the implication these days is that somehow what mainland China is doing runs contrary to the agreements in the original handover. It's actually nonsense. There was always a requirement for national security laws to be passed. There was an attempt to do so in the early 2000s, and it failed in the face of orchestrated public protest. Eventually, they've succeeded. So Jimmy Lai gets charged. He's found guilty. Pretty hard to not find him guilty, frankly, given all of the publicly available evidence on top of the evidence that was presented in the court. And he was sentenced to 20 years. The West has gone absolutely apoplectic about this, right? But it's got nothing to do with free speech. But I think it's very interesting because it's happened at a time where there's two other things that really brings into question the status of the West, broadly speaking, in terms of all of these sorts of, moral questions. The first one is the actions of ICE in the United States and what's been going on there. There's probably three things actually. The second one is the responses, particularly in the last few days in Australia, as a result of the visit to Australia of the Israeli president, and how there has been a significant police action to clamp down on protesters and to seek to silence those who oppose the visit by the Israeli president to Australia. And the third one, the big one, is the release of the Epstein files, right? So all of these things are going on in the backdrop, and we have this concerted social media propaganda effort to try to distract everybody and make people think that the big issue of the day is Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is not the big issue.
I don't think that's successful, by the way. I mean, most of the people in the West, outside of the bubble of politicians and media pundit, nobody know who Jimmy Lai is, and nobody cares. And this is not a issue that simply average Americans or average British people care about. And like, who the heck is Jimmy Lai? And exactly. And the Jimmy Lai, the way they describe Jimmy Lai in Wall Street Journal called Jimmy Lai the Rupert Murdoch of Asia, right? Why would an average Joe Pack six-pack from Michigan care about the Rupert Murdoch of Asia? And Jimmy Lai, the interesting thing, interesting thing about Jimmy Lai is, he's a media tycoon. He owns a Apple Daily, a media empire. But for the last several years leading up to the Hong Kong protests, the Apple, his group, the Apple Media Group, has been bleeding money. Yet somehow Jimmy Lai was able to funnel a lot of money. I mean, everybody knows he was the financial backer of the Hong Kong aka Hong Kong protest, or aka I would call Hong Kong riot. He is the main money backer. So the question would be, where did he get that money? Because we know his media empire has been bleeding money because advertiser has been avoiding it after he went down really publicly anti-China rant. And there's a lot of question to be asked. Also, his relationship with Mark Simon, who again is very publicly his number two right-hand man, who come from a very pedigreed CIA family background. And the whole 2019, I think looking back now from 2026, it's very obvious whatever the 2019 so-called Hong Kong protest was a orchestrated color revolution that failed. I mean, but I think the reason why all these Western intelligence agency decide to blow their wad, so to speak, because Hong Kong was the forefront of the Cold War. It was like the cloak and dagger place during the Cold War. There's a lot of Western intelligence agency have their hands in it. Whether it's MI6 or CIA, and the reason they decide to blow their wad in 2019, I think, also was to impact then the Taiwan election, that actually got Tsai Ing-wen reelected. So Tsai Ing-wen was able to play the scaremonger tactic during her reelection. So you see what happened in Hong Kong. This is what happens if you go along with China's one country, two system. Yeah. That ploy worked. That got Tsai Ing-wen a second term.
Well, you've seen, of course, in the last couple of days or the last day or so, that Lai Ching-te, Tsai Ing-wen's successor, has jumped onto the bandwagon as well, right? I mean, he's in a desperate position. His public standing is, nothing short of weak. He actually became the leader of the Taiwan province on the back of a minority vote, right? So he gained 40% or so of the vote. Opposition split. He came through the middle. but he's never established a particularly strong mandate of any sort at all. And I don't think it's helped him when he spent, some months essentially currying favor with both Israel directly, but also trying to, through cultivating and currying favor with the Israeli lobby, APAC visiting Taipei, amongst other things, trying to use that as a way of currying favor in Washington as well. And all that tells you, I think, is there's a political desperation and a narrowing of the base. Even the latest issues on the island, with the American approvals to sell those additional arms, they're not getting it through the budget in Taipei itself, right? So they're facing all sorts of problems with even being able to mobilize the island population through its political arm to go down this pathway. And it's looking like an increasingly desperate and humiliating outcome, frankly. And unsurprisingly, he's also jumped onto the Takaichi bandwagon after her resounding win in the Japan elections. But I just wanted to touch on the Epstein stuff, right? Because the Epstein backdrop actually exposes the absolute moral bankruptcy of the collective West. So whenever the collective West at the moment points its finger at anyone about, free speech, democracy, all things, good and nice, that supposedly someone else is violating, some human right here or there, it's another day that the United States and its transatlantic allies and subordinate partners is ignoring the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room isn't just the protection of a whole caste of pederasts, right? But it's the proof positive that not only do we have a caste of people who behave like absolute heinous, debaucherous animals, but they come from the political class itself. The highest echelons of the political and commercial elite are wrapped up in this absolute scandal. And every day that the elite and their media handlers and others try to spin a story about something else in the world is another day that they are avoiding responsibility for what, frankly, is the greatest moral test that America and the collective West are likely to face this side of the 21st century. And until they confront that and come clean on it and recognize the environment that actually made it possible for this sort of stuff to happen day in, day out, under their very nose, in fact, on their very watch, with a bunch of their own deeply involved and implicated in it, until they come to terms with that and come clean on it and recognize what it is, they've got no standing to point their fingers at anyone, anywhere in the world about anything. So now that I've got that off my chest, we might move on.
Well, I like to point out nobody has been charged, other than Epstein, Epstein and Maxwell. Nobody else has been charged. Even though we have the Epstein file, we have all the data dump. We know, a lot of people who's in on it, and yet nobody's getting charged. And this is just it's almost like the political elite of the West expect us to accept it. Like that's kind of the political. It's like an imposed political helplessness. Like you know what we're about, and we also know there's nothing you can do to change it. And look, but even given, go ahead.
I was just going to say, how desperate it gets when they resort to it's Russia's fault, right? So Epstein is actually a Russian spy now, right? A Russian spy who incidentally couldn't get himself a visa to Russia, to a point where Mandelson actually offered to help. Right? So, but this is how desperate it gets. And this is what I mean by the sort of moral bankruptcy and the self-esteem crisis that the West has actually exposed itself to now. Right? Many people from outside the West, and even critics from inside the West, understood this, but that you could never get it out there in the way that it has become out there. I remember, and I'd be interested in your view on this because you've spent a lot more time in the US than I, but MAGA, the MAGA base, one of the issues that they actually mobilized around in 2024 was the release of these files. And then for reasons that I still find difficult to fathom, Trump then spent the best part of 2025 either refusing to release them, not an issue, or pretending that they were a fake, Democrat Party fake, or that there was nothing to hide and don't you worry about it. But for whatever reasons, there was an attempt to sweep it all under the carpet. And at some point, all of these issues must start to peel away at the MAGA base, not in whole, because there's obviously rusted on true believers. They'll go with the flow and believe anything and everything. But there must be a solid cohort of people who must feel incredibly let down by this entire episode. It confirms for them, of course, all of their worst imagined possibilities, right? But the fact that it's out there now with all the redactions and with still millions of pages unreleased, so people know that it's even worse. It's deeper and wider than we even know it is today. And it must become a real problem for that political base coming into midterm elections. Yes,
indeed. I think there is a splintering of the MAGA base right now over many things that Trump has done, but particularly the Epstein file as well, because for a while there was supposedly this QAnon conspiracy about Pizzagate, right? And it turns out the Pizzagate is real because it's really about Epstein. The real Pizzagate is actually Jeffrey Epstein, and everyone is implicated. All of the elite, no matter whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Trump, Clinton, everybody's in on it. And I think there's a lot of disillusionment right now in U.S. politics. I think there was already baked in. But now there's even more disillusionment. Like recently, there's a trend called on social media. Like people say, "Oh, I'm in a very Chinese phase of my life." All the young and Zoomers posting with Chinese aesthetics, and then that got New York Post to post, "Oh, why are all these youngins, chasing after like the aesthetics of a communist country, right?" But what it's almost like the young people have totally giving up on their society being controlled by pedophiles, confirmed pedophiles.
They're disgusted. I think people are just deeply disgusted. They already had political reasons to be alienated from the elite, but they are now just deeply, genuinely disgusted as human beings. And this turn to China maxing, I think they call it, isn't it? This turn to China, in a sense, is a turn to a more wholesome lifestyle aesthetic, drinking hot water, these sorts of things. They're sort of symbolic, but at the same time, I think they speak to a contrast to what is a Sodom and Gomorrah kind of situation, clearly amongst not just a sliver of people, an incredibly large cohort of political and commercial elite, clearly tightly intertwined with each other. And the problem is that it does reinforce or even affirm, many conspiracy theories. I must say I've never been prone to conspiracy theory because I think that if it's a choice between conspiracies or essentially coincidental incompetence, I've usually gone for coincidental incompetence. But when you've got something like this, and that people congregate in a specific location, the island, you start to wonder whether, in fact, they do spend a lot more time orchestrating things than you might otherwise believe. Look, I think people are just it's affirmed their worst sense of what the elite are like. They're totally disgusted, and they really just want a big broom to go through the whole thing, right?
And you have that European lady in interview says, "Oh, because Jeffrey Epstein is at the center of all these powerful networks, you will be a loser if you don't find yourself in the Epstein file." I mean,
yeah.
Why would you even say that?
No, that's a win. That's a win. And what's your claim to fame? Well, I was on the island and I got named. That's my. I mean, seriously. I mean, it's an episode in American history which really just peels away the sort of moral veneer, and I think, for me, apart from being totally disgusted by it, I think it just peels away that moral veneer, and it reminds the world that the collective West and the United States at its pinnacle have no grounds of any sort to point fingers at anyone else. And if there were doubts before now, there should be no doubts now. And countries around the world can find both solace and confidence in their own morality, in their own modes of good conduct, and to actually pursue them, not as subordinate, uncivilized, lesser modes of being versus liberalism and Western civilization, but actually as entirely legitimate, decent ways of going about running a society, and for people to relate to each other, and in particular to relate to young people and children. Right? The idea that these people were sexual predators around young people and children is a disgusting indictment, really, on. It's just not a cult. It's not only this culture, right? But it's this sense of impunity, that they were above it all, that they could get away with it and do to whoever whatever it is that they wished. Just filth and disgusting. And frankly, if you had a scintilla of belief that maybe the West stood for anything that resembled some level of being a moral beacon, forget about it. It's all over. They've got to apologize to the children. They've got to apologize to themselves, and then they've got to apologize to the rest of the world.
I don't think that apology is coming forward.
Never.
I mean, right now they're pointing fingers. Right now, this is what they're doing. They're pointing fingers every which direction. Besides pointing, but besides saying that Epstein is a Russian agent, which is obviously nobody believes that. When it's so like the elephant in the room is obviously the Mossad connection, but they're trying to say, oh, it's Chinese, it's Russian. I mean, like even Steve Bannon, who had been outed as this cohort of Epstein, and even in their email exchange, Stephen Bannon says, we're gonna destroy China. And now they're saying, oh, actually, Steve Bannon is working with a CCP-linked billionaire, by which they mean Miles Quad, this famously anti-China, anti-CPC fugitive billionaire that lives in the United States.
Right? This is the FLG.
Yeah. Yes.
It's part of the same story.
But now they're saying Steve Bannon is actually working for the Chinese intelligence, which is crazy because Steve Bannon hates China, and he works with this Chinese dissident billionaire guy who made a career of sponsoring all these anti-China social media networks. And just because Miles Guak is Chinese, so in their logic, well, he must be a Chinese communist spy. I mean, that's their kind of circular reasoning now, which also should serve.
Gordon Chang thing, right? But this is the Gordon Chang thing too, right? China's going to collapse, is imminently collapsing, and he's clearly an asset of the People's Republic of China. But this is the thing, right? And this is why I think increasingly it's hard to take any of this stuff coming out of the West, its propaganda arm, seriously anymore. I know that the Congress commissioned a whole bunch of this propaganda through the budget appropriations that have passed over the last few years. There's billions of dollars available, right? So you get why people jump on the bandwagon and do all of this, because they're on an earn. But this isn't a credible earn. And like that European woman that you mentioned, if you think associating yourself with all of this is a winning strategy for your own personal reputation, then you've got rocks in your head. And there will be no apology, as you say. But all of these propagandists would be well advised to sort of pack up and go on holidays for a couple of weeks and come back, because they do themselves no favors whilst they are digging a hole for themselves. And this is the point. I mean, I guess, look, I know that there will be no public apology, of course, but in a sense, it is a case of saying, go and do some serious self-reflection, folks, and rejoin humanity after you've done that. And if there's one thing, of course, that the American elite are not very good at, it's a good dose of self-reflection. But this is precisely, at a minimum, what this moment calls for now, right? This isn't a winning strategy to try to distract people, either by accusing Jeffrey Epstein of being a Russian spy, or by trying to run, an aggressive propaganda piece about a guy in Hong Kong that no one knows about or cares about. This is a moment, and I think this is the misread, isn't it? The American elite have misread how deep the sense of disgust there is from their own people, ordinary, decent Americans, not to mention everyone else across the rest of the world.
Well, I don't even think they even themselves believe they're pointing fingers and shifting blame is really going to shift the public opinion. I think what's really happening is all these pundits, all these news media channels that's coming out with the story. It's not that they think they can convince the public, but I think this is more demonstration of their loyalty to the establishment. Like, hey, we play ball. Right, we will spit out the most ridiculous story that no one even believe, then like tarnish our reputation, drag our reputation through the mud. But we play ball. We will do whatever you guys want us to do. I think that's really what it is. It's a public humiliation ritual that demonstrates their loyalty to the cause, which is to the pedophilic establishment. And and I think
it's just it's hard to fathom how people are willing to do that, right? People usually have some limit somewhere, and I would have thought, committing your personal reputation to backing the great pedophilia protectorate should really be, at least the bottom line. But for these people, it isn't even a bottom line, and the total silence on all of this. It is quite remarkable. And but anyway, look, for me, these questions. It wasn't so much about American imperium this past fortnight, Carl. It was really about the collapse of the moral fabric or the moral facade of the collective West that caught my attention. The other thing, by the way, which I think is probably worth having a chat about, is the election in Japan. Again, the propaganda has been working quite hard to try to spin this as a rebuke of China's position last year in response to Takaichi's remarks concerning Taiwan Island. But again, I think it speaks to a certain amount of desperation from from the propagandists, because China would have said what it was going to say, regardless of whether or not she was going to call a snap election, and it does it for its own reasons. How that plays out, of course, will take its own time, but the propagandists, I think, are again proving that they are willing to clutch at straws and avoid what I think are actually some pretty serious issues, but also some possibilities and opportunities coming out of this election. Where she gained a resounding majority in the Diet. So
I think people are desperate because they feel like, okay, finally, at least we have Japan on our side. Because I see a lot of these Western right-wing people, posting edits of like, the Japanese World War II aesthetics together with Takaichi's election, because they know what she's about. They know she is like ultra right wing, even in Japan, and they like that because they thought, okay, at least Japan is on our side, will help us to contain China, because they knew United States alone can no longer contain China by itself. So they're hoping, oh, okay, at least we have Japan on our side. But they as for like the media pundits, talking about, oh, how this is a lose for Xi Jinping. Again, this is like a total misreading. This is why I think a lot of the people, a lot of talking points from the West about China is 100% projection, because China's response to Japan is not an attempt to alter Japanese domestic politics. It was never about, okay, we're going to put pressure on Japan so Takaichi will lose the election. That this is kind of the tactics the United States is famous for, is to interfere in other countries' domestic politics, to do regime change, to do color revolution. China doesn't care about that. Only China cares about is issue of Taiwan, which is an issue for Chinese sovereignty. That, like you said, China will react regardless. If someone like Takaichi impinge on the Chinese sovereignty the way that she did, whether she wins election in Japan or not, that's immaterial.
Let's not forget firstly that the snap election was called at the end of January. China's response to her comments in relation to Taiwan was in 2025. There was no hint that there was going to be a snap election then. In other words, the chronology doesn't even back up this particular line of argument. As you say, China, Beijing, would have said what it had said, regardless of whether Takaichi was prime minister or whether it was still her predecessor, had he said the same things. And the position won't change going forward. It's a bit like recently there's been a bit of chatter about how Taiwan might become part of the bargaining chip, right, with President Trump's visit to Beijing, or likely visit to Beijing in April. And I've often said to people, I said, Beijing's not going to have Taiwan Island as a bargaining chip, because you don't bargain sovereignty. Sovereignty is just sovereignty, and you don't trade that. It's not a chip at all. So I don't think that the question of Taiwan was ever a political bargaining question, and so that's the first misread. The second misread, I think, is that by and large, her election success, and in some ways, in terms of the 2/3 majority in the Diet, is a resounding success, is nonetheless built on a relatively narrow and arguably potentially fragile public mandate. Because let's not forget that Japan has voluntary voting, firstly. About 55% of eligible Japanese voted. In the group tickets in the election, so there's single constituency members, and then there are multi-member constituency groups. Her party received about 36% of the vote. 36% of 55 is about 19. Right? So what we're talking about is 19% of eligible Japanese electors actually voting for her party, but which, because of the nature of the system, translates into a massive winner's bonus. So 19% of popular support out of a total population, 45% of which didn't bother voting, leads to 67% in the Diet. That's called a gerrymander, right? But this is how the system works. And so I think it delivers to her big numbers in the Diet, which she should use, right? Because if you don't use it, it'll create a problem for you anyway. But the challenge always is the narrowness of the actual popular base. And if you looked at both the election results in the UK and also President Trump's election in 2024, you'll actually find that what appears as a massive victory in terms of either the Electoral College or seats in Parliament, in the case of the UK, is actually based on about 1/3 of the population supporting you. And again, it's because a whole bunch of people don't bother turning out to participate. They've given up on the system. And the system is designed to give a big winner's bonus to those who, come in first. And that's what we see. And they've squandered their mandates now. You can see that President Trump's mandate is actually really narrow again. People losing faith. There is a base, they're rusted on hardcore, but that's all he seems to have left now. Anybody who gave him and the administration, the new administration, some benefit of the doubt, they've lost faith already. And it's only a year in. UK, the Prime Minister Starmer, I think from memory, is now the most unpopular Prime Minister in post-war history. Right? This is astounding stuff. And he's been Prime Minister for less than 2 years. And again, it's partly because the big numbers in the Parliament mask a very fragile popular mandate. And I think the same challenge arises for Takaichi.
I saw, people during Starmer's visit in China, there are a lot of Chinese citizens, rushing to have group photo with Starmer. I made the remark, like, he's more popular in China than he is in his home country, because I just cannot imagine the same thing happen in Britain, where the average British people will try to rush to have picture.
Well, the same happened with Macron, right? Because Macron's popularity in France is, at the bottom of the barrel too. But when he visited China, he had a rock star welcome, go for a walk around the lake and things. And which is probably why they go to China. It's a little self-esteem boost.
Well, I think the reason is because for the Chinese people, they see whether Starmer or Macron as representative of their country, right? They see Macron as a representative of France and Starmer as a representative of UK. Not they rushing to have photo with Starmer or Macron is not a judgment on necessarily on Starmer and Macron themselves personally. It's really like, they have expressed their friendly, cordial feelings to the country they represent.
When friends come from afar, 有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎. So, it is polite and good practice to welcome friends from afar and treat them well. They're visitors, they're guests. And, and that's what you get, right? But then they go back home. And and of course, Starmer's now caught up in the Epstein stuff via Peter Mandelson. And he's not the only one. You've also got Gordon Brown, who was in The Guardian or The Times, opining about how he feels terribly let down by Mandelson. He didn't think he was a man of such bad character. Really? Most people who followed British politics actually know that Mandelson was a very much a behind-the-scenes Svengali puppeteer, puppet master kind of character. He knew where the bodies were buried. In fact, he probably buried a bunch of them. And he was certainly well known to being borderline ethical, right? So, the idea that you're shocked by by Mandelson being intimately involved in the Epstein affair. Should we call it Epstein Gate? And then of course, there's Tony Blair. Uh, Total silence so far. Won't say a word. So British politics is a mess. The country is largely dysfunctional, socially and economically, and and again, I look at all of this, Carl, and you think, how is it that you've got a political elite who have literally become so detached from the affairs of their own country, right? So, the Epstein stuff actually tells you, in a certain sense, how not only detached they've become, but how arrogantly detached they've become. But you see it everywhere, even for those who aren't directly implicated in the Epstein stuff. It's quite obvious that they are a political elite who have become clueless about the things that are affecting their own country. Just as well they get a nice welcome in Beijing. Otherwise, could you imagine if they didn't? It'd be a massive blow to the ego that even a visit to another country doesn't get you a rock star welcome. It's a woeful state of affairs.
Back to Japan, though, I think Takaichi had planned this. I mean, she knew what she was getting into. She knew that by provoking China over her Taiwan statement, she will get a response from China. And then that will lead to a backlash of rise of nationalism inside Japan, which would help her, win the next election. I think she planned the whole thing. I mean, it's just that she placed her own political career above the actual interest of Japan, because I think she clearly, like, she's leading Japan on a very self-destructive path, during giving a very bad economy, declining demographics, aging population, and given all the and with all the additional tariffs slapped on by United States, she is now committed to devote more spending into military, into rearming Japan, and this might prove popular in immediate term among his right-wing support circles, but it's not good for Japan. It's not. It does not bode well for Japan. But then, just like politicians everywhere, who cares about what happens a few years down the road?
One of
Only
your
cares.
issues, right? Well, look, Japan does have some very big challenges, right? But one of the interesting, and I'll touch on those in a tick, but one of the interesting dynamics about such a monster majority is that they're often a blessing in disguise, because what you also have is a much larger number of mouths to feed and a much larger number of politicians in a diet who believe that they should be promoted and that they've got their own personal agendas and things that they want to pursue. And large majorities often lead to a collapse in party discipline. Small majorities, parties often hold together a lot tighter. So one of the challenges that I think she could face is actually a fairly rapid disintegration of party discipline as factions and sub-factions and various personal interests begin to air their own pet projects. That's the first thing that I think she's going to need to deal with. How does she hold the show together? And it is an irony because, but it's a problem that comes when you actually have big wins, right? You've got a bunch of goodwill behind you inside the party for a while, but you've also got the seeds of jealousy, ambition, and all of that mixed in. She's also got some, serious rivals. And of course, at the moment, she's untouchable, but, politics is politics, and the rivals will be biding their time. And any small stumble is going to be pounced upon. Now, small stumbles happen, of course, more typically in environments where parties have big majorities. people are careless. They aren't as focused on behaving well. And it could be a very small thing. It could be someone in cabinet who overspends on a meal somewhere that suddenly becomes big news and creates a political crisis. So I think that that's a sort of a short-term problem that she needs to confront. But I think you touched on, in a sense, the big issues or the real issues. You can win an election big, but you know what? The issues don't go away, do they? The issues don't sit there and say, oh, she's now got a big majority, so I'll just pack away. Right? My demographic problems will disappear because the government's got a big majority. The fact that Japan is heavily dependent on expensive imported energy, well, that's going to disappear too because she's got a big majority. The fact that Japan has a food problem, right, and inflation, well, that'll just disappear too because, you know, the food market takes a look at the diet and says, oh, you know, two-thirds majority, that certainly trumps the real issues of the day. But of course, none of that happens. So we've got inflation as a problem. We've got what are essentially very, very flat wages growth for the majority of the Japanese. And she's promised wage increases, but not paid for by the government. But she somehow wants the private sector to pick up on wage increases. But she's not doing that by backing trade union organization because she's from the right of the political spectrum. So she's not going to do that. So how is she going to deliver on real wage increases? Big problem. One possible way is to somehow catalyze a monstrous run of productivity growth. In theory, you might say that that could happen because Japan is going to embark on an expansive program of energy system transformation that's going to drop energy costs. It's going to robotize and automate and AI its economy. But to do those things, Carl, let's say that that's doable. Let's say it's doable. It's only doable if they have tight supply chain collaborations with China. It's not doable otherwise. You can't actually solve Japan's structural economic problems without having good relationships with China. The next issue that I think she's going to confront is the regional security challenge. It's one thing to talk about boosting military spending. The other issue is the DPRK. Boosting military spending doesn't resolve the security risks that Japan itself feels by having a nuclear-armed DPRK just over there. And you can only deal with the DPRK by having good working relationships with China and with Russia, right? So there's a lot of work ahead of her that can't just be sort of brushed away on the back of, you know, a few slogans during an election, a little bit of nationalistic feeling, and a little bit of rah-rah that got behind her. She's clearly a formidable and incredibly capable political operator. You know, there's no two ways about that. You don't become prime minister, especially in a society where men have traditionally run the show, by being a shrinking violet and not being streetwise and cunning. Right? So she does bring capability to the table, but the circumstances that she now finds herself in, with a stonking majority sitting in behind her, are incredibly challenging, and in fact will test the extent to which her rhetoric can be squared with the realities that she faces. Right? You don't solve your economic problems or your security problems in the region by not having good relationships with China. She's likely to have to confront the question of Russia as well, which they've quietly done with the Sakhalin projects, right? But Russia is a part of the Northern Asian Arctic furniture. Unavoidable. Russia and China have had naval exercises off the coasts of Japan. You don't solve North Asia without the Russians at the table. Is that going to be possible or not? Some might say that given that Russia and the United States may be having some more sensible talks, and I think maybe is probably about as good as you'd say. And in fact, I would suggest that it's actually going nowhere. But you know, does that create a window where she can pursue a détente with Russia. Right? Can that help her find a pathway back to having a sensible, balanced relationship with China that she needs for energy security? Because they've got their green transition stuff going, right? So Japan's committed to this sort of overarching clean energy stuff, and that means actually importing a bunch of things from China. Japan talks about wanting to become a food superpower. She wants to be 100% self-reliant in food. A pipe dream, to be honest with you. But she wants that, and in fact wants Japan to be an exporter of foods. Well, if you're going to do that, you're probably going to need to have some reasonably good relationships with a big food market. I'm just trying to guess what that might be. Oh, anyway, just over the sea, there's a pretty big food market that has historically bought quite a lot of food from Japan. And of course, you need technology for agricultural productivity. You also need fertilizers, and of course fertilizers are energy intensive, and lo and behold, the Russians are actually pretty good at manufacturing fertilizer. So I think she's got actually a lot of real world problems and challenges that can actually only be confronted constructively if she uses her majority in a sense to repudiate her campaign rhetoric. Right. And now that's a difficult political problem, because in a sense, she's got a window to recalibrate a relationship with China so that it actually comes back onto a level keel for economic reasons first and foremost, and then progressively, around those security issues, especially the DPRK, and the potential further nuclearization of the region. Because of course, on the other hand, Carl, she's also wanting not only to boost military expenditure, but there are pressures in Japan for Japan to nuclearize itself. Certainly, there are pressures in Korea to do the same, and they are there for the same reason. By the way, both the Japanese security strategic elite, as well as those in South Korea, have both come to an understanding in their own ways that the Americans are not reliable. So, she's sitting there in a position where she knows that the Americans aren't reliable. The Americans occupy Japan with 90,000 troops. They're pushing her to spend more money, mainly on American stuff. She needs good relationships with China. And she's got Russia, which is a source of energy that Japan also desperately needs. If she can navigate through this, she will prove to be a formidable politician and one for the ages. But if she can't navigate through this stonking majority that she's achieved off the back of a bit of nationalism will end up proving to be nothing more than a blip. And Japan will continue to bumble along with economic and security problems.
I have serious doubt whether she will be able to do 180 on her policy toward China. I mean, I just don't see that happening.
Well, look, the only conditions that actually make it possible is a stonking majority. Ironically, because she can get away with a bit more. Whether she will or not, it's a totally different story. And of course, there are plenty of her own backers who will be totally opposed to the 180, right? So this is very difficult. But funnily enough, in politics, I've often found over the years that the party or the grouping that is most able to do the thing that needs to be done, knowing that it's going to ruffle a lot of feathers, are those on the side of the issue itself. So, for instance, if trade unions need to be, brought under control, then the best party to do that is actually the Labor parties. So, because they can handle their own constituency. So the best placed people to sort of deal with this China issue are actually the hardline nationalists. They are the only ones who've got that sliver of political room to get away with it. because you know, if there was anyone else who tried to do it, they'd be strung up, right, politically. She has the chance of getting away with it. Whether she will or not, as you say, I think that there's a massive question mark over it, because to do so will mean that she will take political hits, so she'll use up political capital very quickly. But it would require an incredible amount of political courage to do this, and you know, it's hard to see where that courage is going to come from.
Yeah, I mean that's basically only Nixon can visit China, right? But
Correct.
Nixon visit China under a very specific circumstances, which is the United States tried to play China card against the Soviet Union. Right now, I mean, it's pretty consistent pattern. The Japanese elite have hitched their bandwagon to the U.S. Imperium because they benefited for the last 40, 50 years. And I just don't see any kind of compelling reason to do like a Nixon in China moment.
No, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think that there's enough circumstantial pressure to force her hand on this. And you know, certainly not in the next 6 months. But of course, it's actually this next 6 months that gives her the best window as well. Right? But if there's no pressing need, circumstantial need, then she'll try to get away with not doing anything. There will be other problems as a result, you know, inflation, the challenges around the energy transition that they're trying to engineer, without which you're not going to get your sort of efficient implementation of automation, AI, et cetera, which impacts productivity growth, which then impacts wages growth. And so I think we're going to see the likelihood of a continuation of a pretty flaccid economy. Limited demand growth domestically. The military stuff, yeah, you can pour some money into it, but it's still quite narrow, right? You know, and it doesn't have a lot of spillover effects onto the rest of the economy. And you know, and in some respects, it'll be a majority squandered.
Well, so do you have any? I'm asking you again to look into your crystal ball. Do you foresee a period of relative peace up to before the Trump's visit to China? I'm talking about between United States and China in particular.
Look, well, no, I don't foresee that at all, because one of the things about President Trump is that he has a track record, firstly, of acting in short-term capricious ways. You know, just out of the blue, he'll do things. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that he does have a pattern, a sort of a style of preparing for these sorts of things, and that is that he seeks to create points of leverage, create an issue that you can take off the table in negotiations, for example. And I think that there is actually a pretty good chance over the next month and a half or so that we'll see a few more things that will be flashpoints that, whilst won't destroy the prospects of a trip, nonetheless will create issues that will enable the trip to deliver wins. So in a sense, you've got to remember what President Trump is actually quite good at is creating the problem that he then solves by announcing the removal of it and then declaring victory. So, you know, announce another tariff, announce an export restriction, announce something in response to the Jimmy Lai stuff that he can then take off the table later as part of a win. You know, so I think you know, there's actually a good likelihood of this sort of behavior unfolding for the next little while. There are some face-to-face meetings coming up at an official level, following up on the trade discussions and things. And so, you know, let's see how that all goes. But there are some thorny issues, right? So we've had the pressure put on Panama in relation to the ports there. We've had finally an arrangement come to bear on TikTok America. So in some respects, that issue is a bit off the table. There have been some successful things, I think, around fentanyl in one shape or another. Certainly the number of overdose deaths in North America or in the United States from fentanyl have dropped. That's a good thing. We've got, there's an attempt to open up the China market by allowing NVIDIA to sell its H200 kit. It doesn't look like the Chinese side is really that keen on it, but nonetheless, so I think President Trump's trying to create few elements of ostensible goodwill. We signed off on the H200. We've done this, we've done that, but at the same time, I think he will want to create some issues that give him some points of leverage that he can use. But look, there's one thing that's very, very clear. And that is that the United States has very little leverage over Beijing. And but if it actually just treated Beijing with respect and treated people normally, it probably would have a better chance of getting an outcome than trying to play this, leverage game. The leverage stuff just doesn't seem to work very well when it comes to the folk who occupy Zhongnan High. In fact, it causes them to dig their heels in. No.
Yeah, it's
see.
hard
What
to.
do you think? What do you think? Do you think we're going to have peace for 6 weeks?
I thought there might be a semi-détente, but you're right. You're right. Trump. So that's Trump's negotiation style. I mean, he will create the problem so he can claim that he solved them later when he takes those problems off the table. So you're quite right. There could be.
It'll be the 10th war. It'll be the 10th war that he stopped.
Give that man a Nobel Peace Prize already, Jesus. Okay.
In fact, he's probably stopped the Japan-China war already.
Well, on that happy note, thank you again, Dr. Powell, for coming to talk to us. I always gain something, a new insight every time I talk to you. And thanks for people who want to follow you on social media or otherwise, where would they go?
Yeah. So, warwickpowell.substack.com for written things, and channel on YouTube, and
Okay. Thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. Bye-bye.